Welcome to the show, the podcast that dives into the battles women fight on the front lines and within. I'm your host, Olivia Nunn. This series is proudly sponsored by MilMentor, the military's community's largest on-demand mentorship network built by veterans for veterans and their families. From job support to networking, find your mentor at milmentor.com. Now, let's dive into today's episode where resilience, service, and strength take center stage. This is Women of War, and I'm here with U.S. Air Force pilot and extraordinaire, Nicole Malachowski. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Olivia.
Yeah, so we met a long time ago. We've been on different stages together. I had the opportunity when I was with MOA to interview you back then, and now I get the awesome opportunity to actually interview you on my podcast. So I'm super excited.
I'm excited too. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So, for those that don't know why I'm excited to share your story, you've done a lot of amazing things in your career as an Air Force officer, not just because you're a pilot, but because you're a great leader. And you also have this really cool thing to your title as well. You flew a very special plane, which we'll jump into, but you also did some amazing things for our community on the backside when you hung up your uniform. So let's share your story. Let's jump into it and tell me where it all started. Why the Air Force? Why not the other forces? And why even the military?
I actually have an answer to this. So I was very lucky to grow up in a solid, middle-class family out there in Central California. And both of my grandfathers had served in the military. They were both in the Navy. One of them was also in the Army. My father had been drafted into the Army during the Vietnam War for a little bit. And so big picture, I came from a family where from a very young age, I knew that military service and wearing your nation's uniform was something that was honorable and noble and good, if you will. And around the age of 5, the air show came to town. And I remember our family went to it because, it's a big family event. It's a patriotic event. And when we went there, there was a jet flying called the F-4 Phantom. And a lot of people may know that that was the fighter aircraft that was the workhorse of the Vietnam War. And this is one of my earliest childhood memories. I remember the F-4 flying by low and fast, and I had to cover my ears because it was loud, and my whole body rumbled with the engine noise, and I could smell the jet fuel. And as a young kid, I thought, that is amazing, right? And then I realized, wait a minute, you can wear your nation's uniform and fly jets. And when I put those two things together, it was about the age of 5 or 6, I decided I was going to be an Air Force fighter pilot.
That's awesome. My partner and I talk about how oftentimes it's all about opportunity, but it's not just opportunity. It's seeing yourself in that opportunity. It's being able to give a child a glimpse of what they can do if they can only see themselves. And I love the fact that at an early age, you saw the opportunity to be able to be a pilot. So fast forward, you're like, this is a trajectory I'm going to take. I'm going to be a pilot. But we know that wasn't an easy road.
No, ma'am.
So explain to me how you were able to come that obstacle because, women weren't exactly allowed to do a lot of those things that we wanted. So how was that road for you? How did you become a pilot? And What were the things that you were flying? How did it all happen?
Absolutely. Yeah. So you bring up a really good point, right? When I made that decision back in 1979, it was actually against the law for women to be fighter pilots in the military. But, a 5-6-year-old kid can't really comprehend that. And it wasn't until I distinctly remember my 6th grade year, it was 1986, I was 12 years old, Top Gun 1 had come out, right? So I am eating it up, right? And I remember my 6th grade teacher, he would have one student every Friday stand up and talk about what they wanted to be when they grew up and how they were going to get there. And so eventually my name was called. I stood up on a Friday and I said, I'm going to be a fighter pilot someday. As you might imagine, there was a lot of laughter around the classroom. And my teacher distinctly said, sit down and come back when you have something more realistic. I remember going home and just bawling my eyes out, putting my face in a pillow like a 12-year-old would. And that was the day that I realized, what do you mean it's against the law? I was literally beside myself, verklempt. You're telling me that there's actually a law prohibiting women from serving their country as fighter pilots. It's really hard for a kid to get their mind around. And that summer, my parents did a really good thing. They took our family to Washington, D.C. we went to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. And I remember in like a dark, dingy, dusty corner, there was this little 8x12, photo. And it was the WASP, the Women Air Force Service Pilots of World War II. And they were, as you know, America's first women military aviators. And it hit me, wait a minute, like women were serving their country. They were flying fighter and bomber aircraft, not in combat, of course, at that time, but they were flying fighters and bombers and teaching men how to do that and developing combat tactics and all of that. So that really helped me, I think, stay focused on my goal. So being inspired by the WASP meant a lot to me as a young kid. Found myself in high school doing both Civil Air Patrol as well as junior ROTC, staying focused on how do I become a pilot? That's where I discovered the Air Force Academy, set my sights on that. Obviously found myself to the Air Force Academy, class in 1996, graduated high enough to get a pilot slot. And upon my commission as a lieutenant in 1996, I headed off to Columbus Air Force Base, Mississippi for pilot training.
So what was the first aircraft that you found yourself in?
Well, I mean, the first Air Force aircraft I found myself in was a glider. So as a cadet at the Air Force Academy, I was able to solo a glider between my freshman and sophomore year. I loved it so much that I was able to apply and be selected to become a cadet soaring instructor pilot. So cool, right? As a young teenager, 19, maybe 20 years old, being taught to train other young cadets how to fly and how to instruct. And from there, I flew the T-3 Slingsby. And once I got to Columbus Air Force Base, my first jet was the amazing T-37 Tweet, which has been long retired and you can only find in museums these days. Found myself graduating high enough at T-37s that I was able to go, at that time, what was called the fighter bomber track. And in the fighter bomber track of pilot training, we flew the T-38 Talon. And so I was able to fly that, graduated high enough in my class to be able to select my dream jet since I was in high school, which was the mighty F-15E Strike Eagle, arguably the greatest fighter aircraft ever created.
So, we talked about, or you talked about, and you mentioned, there have been roadblocks since the beginning of America's founding about women and their role in the military. And if you know Phyllis Wilson, she talks about how we have been there since the beginning, whether we were lawfully allowed to be there or not, we have been there. And I can only imagine that your time at the academy was not easy, especially when you had this track of, I'm going to be a fighter pilot. And I'm sure the military happily went along with you. Not at all. So what was that like? Now you're commissioned, you're doing what you want, you're flying. But talk to us about what it actually really meant to be a woman. I mean, we already know it's a man's military, but what did it really mean to be a pilot in an industry that's really male dominated, and then an MOS or that's really filled with men? What was that like?
It was interesting because I was in the first group of women who had the opportunity to fly, modern fighter jets, right? We were in that first group that were flying in combat actually in the 90s. And a lot of people don't realize that, but I need to give a shout out, of course, to the original three, at least in the Air Force, Martha McSally, Jeannie Leavitt, Sharon Presler. Without them paving the way, I wouldn't have been able to fly F-15E Strike Eagles. But, at that initial time, I'll be honest, when I showed up at pilot training, and it was, again, very early where women could say, yeah, I want to compete to become a fighter pilot. There were actually, I kid you not, instructor pilots that would refuse to fly with us, me, because they knew I wanted to be a fighter pilot. And I guess, we can shake our heads and be angry, but if I look back at it, I'm like, at least they remove themselves as a biased block, right? What if they had flown with me? And what if that bias had come out on the grade sheets and stuff like that? And so it was awkward that I knew there were instructor pilots who wouldn't fly with me. And at the same time, hindsight being 2020, thank goodness they didn't, right? Because I was able to be with people who instructed me, treated me fairly, and found my way. But that was the first time I think I realized, wait a minute, there's people who don't think women can fly fighters as good as a guy. There's people that don't think women should be serving their country. And so this realization was kind of really hitting me hard at age 21, age 22. And I remember showing up at my very first fighter squadron in the F-15E Strike Eagle back in 1998. F. Lakenheath. It was the 492nd Fighter Squadron, actually. I mean, here I am, living the dream, 22 years old, flying fighters. We are raging up Loch Ness at 500 feet, 500 miles an hour, flying in the Scottish Highlands, right? Life is good. And I have to say that, generally speaking, I was very lucky to have leadership that was open-minded. I'm not going to say they were comfortable. I mean, I could sense their discomfort often, but I feel like I was honestly given a fair shake by my leadership. I remember Lieutenant Colonel Polowitz or Rob Summonsby, great supportive gentlemen. Was it hard for them to adapt? Sure. Because I always remind people cultural organizational change is hard, and it's hard for everybody, right? It's hard to be the vanguard who's trying to, break into something, and shift that culture a little bit. But I was always a little bit sympathetic towards the guys because it's also hard for them, right? All of a sudden, for them, from their perspective, things are drastically changing. And so the gentlemen that were my age tended to be very much more accepting because they didn't know an Air Force without women fighter pilots in it. Any issues that I ever had across my career always came from gentlemen that were older because they remembered an Air Force when women weren't fighter pilots, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. You talk about how these men removed themselves and how you look back on it and you're like, I can appreciate that. And you made me think and pause for a moment. You could take that same thought process when it comes to gender and race too. How I thought in that moment, how many times when you're navigating friendship or professional relationships that, you're taken aback by that and you're hurt by that. But how hindsight, you can appreciate if someone was just very truthful and you could just know where they stood. Well, whether or not I agree with you and how you view me by my gender and by my race, at least I know where you stand. And I know you're not going to stab me in the back. So, some moment of clarity.
And one of the other things, it is clarity. And I think there's beauty in being a pilot and a fighter pilot because it's very objective. Our job there's nothing subjective about it. It's not like you're looking at a lawyer going, I would have presented the case differently, to the jury, right? It is very objective. Everything we have has standards. Everything is recorded. We debrief to the finest detail, frame by frame by frame. And ultimately, the jet itself could care less whether, what your gender, your religion, race, ethnicity, any of that is. It just wants to be flown. And so in a lot of ways, I think it was, easier to be a woman in this career field than maybe some other more subjective career fields, believe it or not. Because everything's debriefed. And at a certain point, about a year into my first fighter squadron, when people started to see, oh, she can meet the standards and she can fly the planes, hearts and minds were either changed. And if they weren't, they were no longer putting themselves in as active obstacles because they started to look silly, right? There was no real leg to stand on. And so they went underground. And that's fine. It's not, it's not my job to make them comfortable, but at least they remove themselves as obstacles.
No, I love that. And the unfortunate part of this whole entire conversation that we're having, while this was done in the 90s, I feel like we are repeating this conversation and it's 2025. And it's just crushing my soul.
It's crushing my soul. It's crushing the soul of our country. At the end of the day, as you mentioned earlier on, women have been wearing their nation's uniform since the very beginning. Women can love their country too, and some of us choose to show it by wearing our nation's uniform. The fact that women have been flying in combat and flying fighter aircraft for over 30 years, and the fact that, our current, I'll just say it, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of War, whatever he wants to call himself, is ignoring that or doesn't know that or is ignorant of it is mind-blowing to me. And it really just is taking away from the contributions that women have had in keeping America free. It's a big deal. Ever since the Revolutionary War, through the WASP of World War II, to the women that are out there flying now.
Yeah. We are part of the warfighter package for sure. We've been there. We continue to be there, and we're going to be.
Yeah. And there's a deeper problem than maybe the chauvinism or the misogyny that we're seeing come out of the current administration against women in the military. Let's look at it. We're also talking about erasing history, removing public access to knowledge and information. This is much bigger than women wearing their nation's uniform. This is about defending freedom of the press, freedom of speech. It's about defending democracy. It's about defending public access to knowledge.
Yeah. I just think about when we go back to the earlier part of this conversation, I talked about kids being able to see themselves. How can you see yourself if you can't go find the history to be able to review it. Because I think about, today's age, right? My daughter, who is in 7th grade, she does a lot of her research on the internet, right? She sits in her room with her little laptop and she Googles things, right? That wasn't the research that I had, right? We had to actually go to this place called a library, right? Yes. You had to actually pull out the drawer, find a little card, then go hunting through the giant library to find stuff, right? But either way, however you're researching, whether it's Google or actually in the good old fashioned library, you have to be able to see yourself. You have to be able to look through history. And
I agree. And you know what? I'm going to, I'll admit a bit of a weakness here, a maturing moment. When I was selected, mid-career to become an Air Force Thunderbird pilot, whose job, right, is to represent, recruit, and retain, whose job in a lot of ways is public relations and public affairs. I hated nothing more at the beginning than being called the first woman Thunderbird pilot, or, every headline in the newspapers, every time a reporter talked to me, I would just, ugh. And then I had an aha maturing moment. I went to one of my very first air shows, and there's kind of this picture where there's a young gal looking up at me like I'd hung the moon, right? She's got a little sweater. I think it says Civil Air Patrol, a big sun hat on, and she's just looking up at me. She's 12 years old. And as they pulled us from the autograph line where I was interacting with her, because, we had to go debrief, she hands me a little piece of paper with her email on it. This is back in 2006. And I remember the public affairs people being like, you can't keep up with everyone. You're, slow the roll because there's going to be so many people who want you to write and blah, blah. But there was something about her. And I remember writing her back, and we established a relationship. And I am delighted to report that she is now a major in the United States Air Force and flies the F-15E Strike Eagle and just had her second child. And so all this to say, I agree with you, Olivia. It means something to see someone who looks like you succeeding.
100%. So you just mentioned something really cool. I don't know if people picked up on it. We're going to come back to that conversation. But before we do, let's take a break and get a word from our sponsor. MilMentor is the military community's largest on-demand mentorship network built by veterans. You pick your own mentor and as many as you like from over 1,000. Whether you're a military spouse looking for resume help, a veteran building his or her network, or looking for a company to target your next step, or soon to be transitioning and planning to start a business, there are recruiters, executives, and professionals across fields waiting to help you. Sign up as a mentor or mentee at milmentor.com. So you just said something, and I don't know if people recognize the little nugget that you just said. You were a Thunderbird pilot. So before we dig into what you were, can you tell us, what is a Thunderbird?
So the United States Air Force Thunderbirds is the Air Force's aerial demonstration squadron. So we go out and we fly air shows around the world, really to represent the Air Force with the honor and the dignity and the respect it deserves, not just active duty members, but the total force, Guard and Reserve, as well as civilians, and importantly, our military families around the world. And so we go to air shows. I think I did over 150 air shows in 2 years across the United States and Europe.
So not to put it lightly, you have to be the best of the best to get to this position.
I don't know that I was ever the best of the best of anything. But
I think you were. You were pretty badass there. And the fact that you were the first woman to be selected to be part of that team. And for me, I think that's pretty amazing.
Well, I want to make sure I say this right. I was the first woman pilot to fly on the team. The very first woman to join the team actually happened around the year I was born, and her name was Sarah Johnson, and she joined in the 70s as an administrative professional. So I always want to honor the women that paved the way before me. I was the first woman pilot. Yeah.
That's awesome. And the fact that you were piloting amazing aircraft, that's no feat. Now you're piloting a very specific type of aircraft that does some very neat aerobatic, is that even a word? Demonstrating, I've seen that. And to me, I'm like, that's not easy. I mean, so I used to race cars, right? And driving is one thing, but then driving in a different way, like that's a whole nother. So hats off to you that you're doing that at incredible high speeds up in the air, all to show what the Air Force can do. So talk to us about, what was that like? I mean, you gave us a small glimpse about, just that one personal touch who she's now a major in the Air Force, but what was that like? Because again, I know that wasn't easy being there. I'm sure you probably had more people that were waiting for you to fall flat on your face than there were people saying, yeah, you go get them. You're going to do amazing.
You hit on something super interesting, actually. I'm 51 years old now, so this has been 20 years since I've done this. So I've had a lot of time to think, and I'm a mom now, so I look at life through a different lens. When I joined the Thunderbirds, I will tell you, I had been in 3 operational F-15E squadrons. I arrived with every single qualification you could have as a fighter pilot, right? Instructor pilot, evaluator pilot, mission commander. I had led my peers in and out of combat. So I show up there, and for the first time ever in my career, I was acutely aware of people actually rooting for me to fail. And that is a very strange and bizarre feeling for a 29-year-old, person to have. And I will be honest, I get asked a lot, Nicole, how hard was it? How hard were the guys? If I could have hand selected a dream team of the greatest officers, brothers, and pilots to fly with, I would not have imagined as good as I got. And I'm not pandering. These guys were absolutely extraordinary, the right people at the right time on this team. Every time the microphone would be shoved in my face, what's it like to be the first woman Thunderbird? They would immediately hear my answer and turn to one of the guys and go, what's it like to fly with the first woman Thunderbird? So there was extra attention. There was extra work. There was indeed an extra challenge and burden that the whole team carried, not just on my behalf as a friend, but on behalf of the Air Force. Because going back to what you're saying, we want our Air Force to be out there representing the face of America, representing the face of the people that are wearing their nation's uniform. Did I have stress? Absolutely. Did I feel pressure? You betcha. And most of it was self-induced, because I also was acutely aware that if I messed up, that it would be a long time before there would probably be another woman Thunderbird pilot. And I wanted to open the door in the way that the door stayed open. And I'm delighted to say, in total, there have been 7 women Thunderbird pilots, including the number 7 who's flying on the team right now. And every single one of them, I can say, arguably, has taken it to the next level as officers, as leaders, and as pilots. And so the fact that we did it in a way that left the door open, I felt very responsible and accountable to do that, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. So you just said something that I could totally relate to, that you put so much pressure on yourself because you wanted to leave that door open. And I think so much of my career, I knew that there was definitely outside pressure. Let's not forget about that.
Sure.
But there's definitely this internal pressure to perform, to be perfect every single day, because I felt like if I mess up even just a little bit, if my one piece of my hair was out of place, if my uniform looked messed up, if I didn't, come to work having everything perfect, they were going to find that as a reason why I wasn't supposed to be here, seated at this table for the next woman to be able to have this job.
Right.
And I was aware of that. And that was constantly on a loudspeaker in the back of my mind.
It's so funny you bring that up. I don't know why this just popped into my head, but my very first fighter squadron back in the 90s, this is how old I am. My first combat time was over Kosovo and Serbia. All right. That's back when, women were flying fighters back then. So, when I was in that first fighter squadron, it was interesting. There were times where I would make the exact same mistake as any new young lieutenant wingman would make. But for some of the guys in the squadron, not all, and in fact, it was the minority, but for some in the squadron, they would take any small mistake, any typical learning mistake, and blow it out of proportion, right?
Yeah.
So an example might be over-G'ing the jet. In the Strike Eagle, you can over-G the jet. Some of them would act like I was the first fighter pilot in the history of Strike Eagles to ever over-G the jet. And then I would be the last to ever over-G the jet. And you're like, that's ridiculous. I don't know a single Strike Eagle pilot who probably hasn't over-G'd the jet. And if they haven't, then they're not pushing the envelope as much as they should. But I'm telling you, this idea that even the typical learning errors and the small errors that even other people would make could sometimes get blown out of proportion by a small group of the naysayers.
Yeah, 100%.
And that was annoying.
100%. As you're saying that, I could think of a dozen incidences in my head. Everything from the way I wrote an operations order to, where I drove the vehicle to name it. I have seen it's a flash, it's like this flash of movie in my head. And I'm like, yep, because Olivia did it. And because I was a woman, it was totally blown out of proportion. We had a huge conversation about it, but.
Right. Well, going back to the Thunderbird thing, I like to remind people I was in the Air Force 21 years. I only spent 2 years on the Thunderbirds, so very proud of it. But I'm much more than just that Thunderbird assignment, but I'm going to highlight another Thunderbird story. Towards the end of my first year flying in air shows, I got pulled aside at an Air Force base while at one of those Thunderbird receptions, because we always have to go to the air show reception the night before or afterwards. I don't remember the specifics here, but I got pulled over by an Air Force 2-star general, a guy who will remain nameless. But I remember he pulled me aside, and I thought it was going to be what people usually say to me. Congratulations on being selected as a Thunderbird. How is it going? Are you enjoying it? Is there anything I can do to be helpful? Any of that, right? Any of the positive stuff. No. He pulled me aside, looked right at me, and one-on-one, there's no witnesses. So this is another reason I can't share all the details, but he looked right at me and said, "We just let you women become fighter pilots, and now you want to go and take this from us too." I'm 30 years old, right? I'm under the microscope. It's a high pressure assignment for any Thunderbird. And I'm just sitting there staring at him thinking, my mere existence is a challenge to his balance. And it was weird that there was this very small group of guys who there were actually Thunderbird alumni who, because I saw the email and I was smart enough to hit print, so I got receipts, said we're going to boycott Thunderbird air shows this year because there's a woman on the team. It's this idea that because a woman is capable of doing something that most men can't, that somehow that thing is no longer cool. Or if a woman was capable of achieving what I did, it's no longer neat. As opposed to, wow, look at us. We did something hard. We became fighter pilots. Look at us. We became part of an elite aerial demonstration team. How amazing. For a small group, the idea that a woman could achieve what most men cannot is hard for them to swallow. I don't know why.
I've had this conversation with my partner on a plethora of topics, not just this. You can apply it to others, right? And oftentimes it's because, and I have to sit with this a lot because I ask that same question, but why? Why would people do this? Why would people make me feel this smaller? Why would people, because to me, it's like, I treat people the way I want people to treat me. I care for people the way that I'd want people to care for me, etc. The golden rule. And for me, I just don't understand. And so I have these conversations like, Olivia, the reason why is because you bring out whatever it is that you're doing, you're bringing out the thing that they can't do. And it's mirroring it to them. And so they are uncomfortable with the discomfort. And because it's so blaring, obvious to them, and because they don't know how to sit with it, it's easy to tear you down.
And I think it was around that time that I was finishing the Thunderbirds and, pinning on 04 and major and moving into that second half of my career that it finally hit me it's not my job to make other people comfortable. It's my job to be the best version of myself, that I can be, and that this realization that only I get to define success for myself. And it's my job to be a master of my craft. And what can I do today, to achieve that?
Absolutely. So let's shift gears a little bit. You've had an amazing career in the Air Force. However, your career kind of shifted in a way that you least expected.
True.
And because of that, you've been a huge advocate. Talk to me about your tick-borne illness and how that changed the course of your career and your advocacy and what you're doing today.
Yeah. So you're right. My career, this amazing career, came to a bit of a screeching halt very unexpectedly and in a very unwelcome kind of way. When I was a lieutenant colonel in the summer of 2012, I was the commander of the 333rd Fighter Squadron. There's no greater honor for a fighter pilot than to command a fighter squadron. And, I was physically fit, mentally fit, spiritually fit, came down with this kind of mysterious illness. Doctors couldn't figure it out. For 4 years, I fought MEBs. For 4 years, I fought to stay in. For 4 years, I was a medical mystery. And in the summer of 2016, I was a full bird colonel working in the East Wing of the White House. And I woke up in my bed there in Northern Virginia, and I had temporary paralysis, locked in syndrome, couldn't move, couldn't talk, couldn't do anything but blink. I went in and out of these kind of moments of paralysis, and they sent me up to Massachusetts General Hospital, where I was diagnosed with late stage neurological tick-borne illness, a tick bite, right? Took down this pilot. Overnight, I was completely dependent on my husband as a caregiver. For 2 years, I was bedridden and housebound, couldn't walk, talk, read, or write in any meaningful way. Did a year and a half in rehab at Fort Belvoir to learn to walk, talk, read, and write again. And during that 2-year period, met an MEB and was found 100% unfit for duty due to the damage from a tick bite. And it's kind of wild to think about, right? That you go from this like elite fighter pilot down to completely broken. And it's a very much an existential crisis. Like, who am I if I'm not wearing my nation's uniform? What's my contribution to society if I'm not an officer and a fighter pilot? And how am I going to provide for my family, right? Because I'm about to lose my job. And we all know DC is an expensive place to live. And it was a really dark time. And, the day of my retirement, medical retirement, 29 December 2017, I was home alone. I have never had a retirement ceremony, and the Air Force mailed me my retirement certificates in a manila envelope. Thank you for your service, right? And that is a pain that I still have in my heart. That's a hole in my heart that I just don't know will ever be mended, because there was definitely feelings of abandonment and betrayal by the Air Force and by the community. But I also was a fighter pilot, right? So I gave myself time to cry. I gave myself time to feel sorry for myself for a little bit. And then I was like, you're a fighter pilot. And it hit me that all the skills and traits and characteristics that I honed as an officer and a fighter pilot were exactly what I needed to survive my illness, to rehab myself, but then also to reinvent myself. And, to this day, I live with a lot of complex chronic symptoms from late-stage tick-borne illness. It prevents me from having an FAA medical. I can't fly anymore. People say, oh, Nicole, I'm so sorry you can't fly. And I tell them it's not the flying that I miss. It's leading airmen. It's being a part of a team. And so at that moment, with all that realization, I realized that, my future self that I need to reinvent myself into is someone who does advocacy work on behalf of the people who are laying in bed like me right now. And I find a lot of purpose as a tick-borne illness patient advocate, giving voice to the voiceless. And I take those same fighter pilot attitude and personality to all of these government committees and nonprofits and academic arenas to try to make a difference.
Because of your own personal journey, talk to me about how we as a community understand or don't understand tick-borne illnesses, how we diagnose it or don't. Explain to me about your journey in all of this. I mean, you just kind of brushed over, just like, hey, I got diagnosed, and like, this is what you do, and you just take a spoonful of this, and it's Mary Poppins, and you're going to be all better. But I know that that's not the truth.
It's not the truth at all. It's far from it. And Olivia, you just opened Pandora's box. We could do an entire podcast episode on the lack of education and awareness on tick-borne illness writ large. But let me just say this. The myth that's out there amongst, I think, just average people like you and me, but also the medical profession, is that Lyme disease and tick-borne illnesses are easy to diagnose and easy to cure. And the science proves over and over again that that is not true. All right. We know in the United States alone, 500,000 people will be diagnosed with Lyme disease this year. That's that we know of. Okay. Of those that are diagnosed and treated with a standard course of 2 to 3 weeks of oral antibiotics, we also know that 10 to 20% of those people are going to remain chronically systemically ill. So that's 100,000 people joining the ranks of complex chronic illness every year due to a tick bite. And I'm only talking about Lyme disease. There's dozens of different ticks around the world that pass dozens of different human disease-causing pathogens, bacteria, viruses, parasites. The only one your doctors know about is Lyme, and that's at a very fundamental level. And so we know some people get treated, they remain sick. Don't even get me started on the people who are diagnosed in later stages of disease where the chances of treatment working don't exist. Here's another example. The standard Lyme disease test that you get, it's called an ELISA Western blot. It's only 50% accurate in the first 4 weeks of disease. And it's in those first 4 weeks of disease that it's most treatable by the antibiotics. It's an antibody test. It takes your body 4 to 6 weeks to create the antibodies to even give you a positive on the test. Did you hear what I just said?
Yeah, so by the time you know it, you've already beyond past the window. Yeah, so you're kind of screwed.
There you go. There you go. And so in my case, it was, I went misdiagnosed and undiagnosed for 4 years. In fact, let me give you the numbers. From the time that I reported to the Air Force flight surgeon with my initial symptoms in the summer of 2012 to the time that I was diagnosed at Massachusetts General Hospital was 1,525 days, more than 24 doctors across 8 specialties, and 3 misdiagnoses. The lack of education and awareness is astounding. So the diagnostic tests are poor, and then treatment options haven't been improved since the 1980s, the same time the tests have come out. So what we're seeing over these last, 5 to 10 years is an explosion of tick-borne illnesses. A lot of it is due to climate change. It's interrupting the life cycle of these ticks. They're living longer. It's also they're expanding into new areas, right? Because the weather and the climate is changing, but also we as people are infringing into these forested and type spaces. And so it's becoming more and more of an issue. We are seeing a lot more momentum and recognition that it's a problem. And we are starting to see an increase in prioritization and funding. Unfortunately, science takes time. And so we're well behind where we should be, but I'm glad to see the vectors in the right direction.
It astounds me that we are so concerned about health in so many aspects, but yet there's data in front of us that says that we need to be looking in a certain direction, but we really haven't moved. And then we could also say that about women's health. I mean, you could get me on a soapbox when we talk about women's health. We're like 50% of the population, and I still feel like we're in medieval times when it comes to our health. But we could do another podcast about that one.
Look, when I was seen at Walter Reed during the depth of my illness, when I was still a medical mystery, I was an Air Force 06 colonel. I met with a rheumatologist at Walter Reed who was a Navy 06 captain. So, right, we're both 20 years in, we're both, peers. He looked at me and said, quote, "You've been a high-performing woman in a male-dominated career field for a very long time. Maybe this is your body's way of saying it's time to retire." Thanks, bro. So insinuating, of course, that it was all in my head, that it was neuropsychiatric or psychosomatic. The irony of the whole thing is it was all in my head. It was an infection of my brainstem caused by bacteria and parasites. But hey, who's keeping tabs?
I love that answer. It's always just like, it's just you. Well, I get it's just me, but can we also take account for all of the external factors that have helped push me in that way? But yeah. I digress.
And arguably what happened to me was preventable, right?
Yeah.
We can prevent tick bites. How come I spent my entire 20 years in the Air Force and I was never trained on how to use permethrin or Procardin or DEET? How come I was never trained on ticks and tick bites and safe tick removal? How come I was never trained on how to recognize those symptoms? Why were my military doctors never trained on how to recognize, to diagnose, and to treat?
So that's interesting because in the Army, I think that's a little different, right? So we treat our uniforms and we're always told to take, DEET and all that other stuff with us, which is carcinogenic. That's the other problem. That's a whole different side of the conversation.
Yeah, we can talk about that too, because I'm
right. So yes, we're going to protect you, and you're not going to get a tick bite. However, you could get cancer. So I think from an Army's perspective, even as a cadet, I do remember we'd always have tick checks. We'd go out into the field, buddy checks, and all that. So we did a good job of that. But I wonder if there was, from a medical perspective, if they understand it any better once you got bit by an actual tick. That's the part that I don't know, because I just know
this is actually true. It's not me being flippant. We've done the research on this. In most medical schools, they get less than 15 minutes on Lyme disease and Lyme disease only. When I was diagnosed, I actually had 5 tick-borne pathogens. Lyme disease was just one of them, and it wasn't the worst of the 5. So I'm just saying the lack of education and awareness in our medical community is very bad. And I empathize because it is not their fault per se. We need to get the information out there. We need the latest science to be inculcated into our medical schools now, so that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we start reaping the benefits of that awareness.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, we can also add that, hormone therapy for women, and giving estrogen is not the answer. Because that's what they say. They're like, oh, just give her estrogen. She's going to be fine. Like, hormone therapy.
It's complicated.
I'm just saying.
It's complicated.
Just saying. But, Nicole, I could spend hours talking to you, whether it be about women and aging. And by the way, you're not old. Just making sure.
I'm wise.
Or your career, because you've done so much. You have paved the way. You are a trailblazer in your own right. Or talking about your advocacy work. I mean, I've had the opportunity to chat with you on numerous occasions. And every single time that I do, I'm always in awe of the things that you do. I feel more educated in each conversation. But we only have so much time. So with that being said, what is the last thing that you would love to leave with my listeners about any of the work that you do?
I don't know that's about the work that I do, but I'm looking around my country right now and I have deep concerns about the direction that it's heading. And we all are looking at these changes from different lenses, right? And from different backgrounds and perspectives. But the one thing that connects us all, and I keep a copy and it ain't a joke, is the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And I implore every single person listening, regardless of your perspective on things, to pick this up and to reread the Declaration of Independence and reread the Constitution. It's the one thing that connects all of us. And I think it's a good starting point for healthy civil conversations. So do me that favor.
I agree. Thank you so much, Nicole. Thank you for spending your afternoon with me and just having an amazing conversation. I'm so glad that we're able to share your story, and thanks for everything that you do.
You're a great American, Olivia. Thanks for your service.
Thank you. And thank you for your service.
Yes, ma'am.
Until next time, keep showing up, speaking out, and standing strong. Thanks for listening to Women of War, proudly sponsored by MilMentor, where the military community finds its mentors.